Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. It's about 7 o'clock, so I'm going to call the September 26th meeting in the Planning Commission to order. Welcome. Thank you for coming. We will start with roll call.
Commissioner Sayoc.
Here.
Commissioner Bourgeois.
Here.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Here.
Vice Chair Erickson.
Here.
And Chair Jensen.
Here.
And Commissioner Talasfor has an excused absence.
And Commissioner Erickson, will you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, the next item on our agenda is the approval of our minutes from our last meeting, which was September 12th. And has everyone had a chance to review them? And if so, is there any corrections, questions, and/or a motion? Commissioner O'Donnell.
I'll move the adoption of the minutes.
Is there a second? Commissioner Erickson, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, so the minutes are approved. Thank you. The next item is written communications. We do have one that is regarding item number 1, which is a modification to condition number 5, which has to do with the address. Is that right? It's correcting the address?
Correct. It's just providing additional clarification within
Okay.
the structure of that condition.
Okay, and Commissioners, item number 1 is on our consent calendar, so if you want to take a second to make sure that that's okay with you. We will go on. Our next item is requested continuances. We do have one requested continuance, and that is item number 3. And item number 3 is a proposed zoning code amendment, A-12-02, which is proposing changes to allowed uses in the C2, which is commercial zone, and it's proposing to allow an office use in a retail space on a very specific property. And staff is requesting a continuance so that that could be properly noticed, so anyone who's interested in it can come and speak about that. And the proposed continuance is until October 10th, which is our next meeting. Is there a motion regarding that item? Commissioner Erickson.
I'll move to accept the staff's recommendation to move this item to the meeting of October 10th.
Is there a second? Commissioner Bourgeois. Any questions or comments on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? It's moved for approval by Commissioner Erickson, seconded by Commissioner Bourgeois, and passed. Our next item is subcommittee reports, and we had one. And for members of the audience, each of the commissioners also serves on other committees aside from this one, including Historic Preservation, General Plan, Conceptual Development Advisory Committee, North 40 Specific Advisory Committee. So we report to other commissioners and the public about what happened in those various committee meetings. So Commissioner Erickson.
The Historic Preservation Committee met with its longest agenda in the last 4 years this afternoon, so had 9 items on the agenda this afternoon. So a robust, full, and challenging agenda. So there were several individual residential properties in both the Broadway District, 2 in the Broadway District and 2 in the Almond Grove District, that were proposing various forms of modifications to the exterior, all of which were approved, met the guidelines and were approved. There was one item that was sent to the Historic Preservation Committee by the Planning Commission about the exterior finishes at residence at 236 and 238 Bachman. That item was actually continued so that we could get some greater clarification about what the direction from the Planning Commission is from the staff. Anyway, there's a long story involved with that, but anyway, it's fine. And then there was also an item, the La Cañada building, which is at the corner of Main and Santa Cruz. They proposed to replace all of the railing that's on the back of the building, if you would, and the stairs and so forth with wood, with metal railing, and that was also approved. There were also two other, in addition to all of those items, there were two informational items for homes that are pre-1941 with requests pending to be removed from the historic resources inventory.
Thank you for that very thorough report. The next item is verbal communications, and this is the time when anyone who's in the audience tonight, if you'd like to speak to us about something that is not on the agenda. So if you're here to talk about something that's on our regular agenda, we'll call that and you can talk about it. If you would like to speak with us about something that is not on tonight's agenda, you can come up and do that for 3 minutes. Would anyone like to talk? Okay, seeing no one. I should say at this point also, just some housekeeping. If you do have an electronic device, we would really appreciate it if you put it on silent, because if it does go off, it can be pretty distracting. No need to turn it off, just put it on silent. The next item on our agenda is on our consent calendar, and let me explain what a consent calendar is. It's an application that's come in that has been reviewed by the staff, and it's been determined that it meets every possible ordinance, policy, guideline, parking requirement, height restriction, zone, applicable zone, and there's been no controversy or opposition or a particular reason to deny it. And when there is something like that, it can go onto a consent calendar, which means that we would move to approve the item without going through a regular public hearing process. We do have one thing on our consent agenda tonight, which is 630 University Avenue. It's a conditional use permit application U-12-014, and it's requesting approval to operate a dance and Pilates studio in that space. The dance and Pilates studio is currently at Linden Plaza, and it's asking to relocate. When something's on the consent calendar, anyone may pull it from the consent calendar, which means we'll hear it in its normal course. We'll go through our regular hearing process. Any member of the audience can pull an item, and any member of the commission can pull an item. Is there anyone in the audience who wants to pull item number 1? Seeing no one, any commissioner wants to pull item number 1. If not, is there a motion? Commissioner Bourgeois.
I'll move to approve the consent calendar, which includes item 1, conditional use permit application U-12-014 at the 630 University Avenue address.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Commissioner Smith, thank you. And Commissioner Bourgeois, I'm assuming that you're including the changed modification or the modified condition that's our desk item.
Thank you. Yes, that would include the desk item.
And Commissioner Smith, that's okay with you? Okay, any questions or comments on the motion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. Passes unanimously, moved by Commissioner Bourgeois and seconded by Commissioner Smith. So we'll move on to our first regular hearing, and let me just give you a short idea of how these go. We will hear a presentation if there's anything to be added to our staff report. All of us have staff reports, and all of us visit properties prior to coming to the meeting. So if there's anything to be highlighted or added to, our staff person will give us that information. Commissioners then have the opportunity to ask questions of staff if there's something they want to have clarified. Once that's done, then we'll call the applicant forward, and if the applicant has I'm going to say an entourage or a team, that team has 5 minutes cumulatively among them to address us on the application. Once that's commissioners may ask questions of the one person or any member of the team. After that, anyone else in the audience that wants to talk about that particular item will call up, and you'll have 3 minutes. And again, you may be asked questions. Once that's completed, the applicant can come forward or not, depending on what they've heard and whether they want to come forward again to clarify or rebut anything they've heard or add to anything they've heard. Then we'll close the public portion of the meeting, and the commission will have a discussion and then make a motion and vote on it. So with that, we have item number 2, which is 268, used to actually be 267 Jared Lane, which is an architecture and site application S-12-041, and it's requesting approval to modify an architecture and site application that's already been approved. I don't have any cards in the benches. You'll see in front of you there's little yellow cards that you fill out if you want to talk. We use that for our records and our minutes, so if you'd like to come forward, the applicant, fill it out at some point and pass it in and let us know who you are. I can't call you because I don't have a card, so you have to, whoever is the applicant, and tell us who you are so we can properly address you.
All right, sorry. Good evening. I'm
Oh, I'm sorry, wait a minute. Just time out for a second. Is there anything to add to the staff report?
No,
Are there any questions of the staff? Sorry. Now you can go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I'm not used to the process. Good evening, I'm Steve Milligan, and my wife and I have been working with our team of professionals building our new home for over a year now. This is our first time building a home, and as you might imagine, it was difficult for us to anticipate all of the various nuances that might occur during construction. As we have progressed in our project, we have discovered a couple of changes we would like to make to our home before it is ready for us to move in. As with the original design that you approved in the spring of 2011, we have asked the architect and his team to do the following. 1, comply with the hillside standards and guidelines. 2, retain the natural beauty and topography of the property. 3, minimize the environmental impact of building on the site. And 4, build a home that will satisfy our needs for years to come. Our application is in front of you tonight because my wife and I have come to realize that when we saw the final frame structure, we realized there was a space for a fitness room without making any significant changes to the approved footprint of the house. In addition, we realized that a room on the ground floor would be extremely dark, but with the removal of a wall, we would be able to put in a window allowing for natural light. So Tom, if you can show a picture. So this is the room on the ground floor that we're proposing to tear out the wall and build it out with the window. And then the second is the fitness room on the edge of the house. Both areas will not increase the approved external footprint of the existing home. The fitness room will be located over the current garage, and the room extension is planned under the entry or patio area. The window for the home will go into an existing wall. The current house has an approved floor plan of 4,421 square feet, and with the proposed additions, the floor plan will become 4,760 square feet. The allowable floor plan is 6,400 square feet. The addition matches the architectural style and detailing of the home that was approved last year. We request that you approve these changes, bearing in mind that they continue to adhere to the overall goals outlined earlier. In case you have questions related to our request, the architect, builder, and landscape architect on the project are all here tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Questions for Mr. Milligan or the landscape architect or builder? I don't see any. Thank you. Anyone else who wants to speak to us about 268 Jared Lane? Now is your opportunity. Okay, I don't see anyone. Mr. Milligan, you want to come up and rebut what you just said? Okay. I'm going to close the public portion of the hearing then, and I will look to commissioners for questions of staff and or a motion. I actually have a clarification question for staff. I understand from reading the report that this is something that could have been approved by staff, but staff brought it back to us because of the nature of the project or the size of the addition?
the project would still, or the modifications would still require an architecture and site site application modification, which we could have processed through the Development Review Committee. Staff chose to forward it to the Planning Commission, partly because it was approved originally by the Planning Commission, but also because we anticipated the possible contention and anticipated that it may get appealed from DRC to the Planning Commission anyways.
And my follow-up question is, I'm assuming that regular notice was given to all the neighbors, so we have not heard from the one neighbor that was concerned about the
Correct.
lots?
It was noticed, as well as the story poles have been up prior to any notification.
Okay. Commissioner Erickson?
I will move to adopt architectural site application S12041, which is to modify an approved architectural and site application constructing a single-family residence and pool on the property at 2008 Jared Lane, and can find that it's in compliance with the Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines and is in compliance with the Hillside Specific Plan, and that all of the required considerations that are necessary in the review of an architectural site application have been made.
Okay, it's been moved for approval by Commissioner Erickson. Is there a second? Commissioner Bourgeois? Any comments or questions on the motion? Okay, I'm going to call the question. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? None. It passes unanimously. Moved by Commissioner Erickson, seconded by Commissioner Bourgeois. There are appeal rights.
Just one clarification. He said 2068. It's actually 268, just to clarify, just to not have any.
Oh,
Yeah, sorry.
thanks. Well, I think we'll get the address right. Can you please fill out one of those yellow cards before you leave so we have your name and address for our record? We'd appreciate it. But there are actually appeal rights, so what are those?
Thank you. So anyone that's not satisfied with the approval of the Planning Commission can appeal this decision. The appeal must be filed within 10 days. Forms are available in the clerk's office, and there is a fee for filing the appeal.
Okay, so we're going to move to item number 4, which is our sustainability plan, and I'm just going to tease Commissioner O'Donnell and see if he had a chance to read it while he was in Turkey.
I actually did.
There you go. This is a recommendation that we'll make after review to the Town Council. Ms. Vicaria, thank you for coming, and goodbye. So we had continued this from our previous meeting because planning commissioners felt that they did not have enough time to adequately go through the very lengthy document and review it. We appreciate the time that we've gotten for it. I understand that we are not going to have an additional PowerPoint, which commissioners, I took it upon myself to say we didn't need a PowerPoint. But is there a presentation tonight just to give us a concept of what the expectations are and what we'll be doing?
There is no planned presentation tonight, but staff did want to note that the consultant is in traffic at the moment and expects to be here at 7:45.
Why we need a sustainability plan. Okay. Let's just ask questions first and see how it goes. So I imagine that I'll just tell the commissioners that how I intended to proceed with this is we do have Appendix E, which sort of gives us a good outline of the action items that we're actually considering. And rather than go through the entire document page by page, unless there's something that you found while you were going through that is not contained in one of those action items that's in Appendix E to discuss, I thought we might just proceed to our discussion or focus on Appendix E because that's where the actual directives, if you will, are. But are there any questions regarding the document or questions of staff that anyone wants to bring up at this point? Commissioner Bourgeois.
Thank you. I'd like to thank staff for the additional time as well as the additional information provided in the most recent staff report. I found it all very helpful. I do have a process-related question about the CEQA analysis for projects. So it says it's going to tier off of the sustainability plan. Could you maybe clarify how that works? So if we see a project that is coming to us, I don't quite understand how that process works. If you could explain that.
So the tiering would be allowed for projects for a specific component of their environmental review. For projects that require environmental review, they can use a sustainability plan to tier off of for their greenhouse gas emissions evaluation in their CEQA analysis. It doesn't mean that they can forego any normal traffic analysis, historical analysis, agricultural, architectural, any of that from the environmental review, but rather just that specific component that's analyzed in the sustainability plan.
So, for example, a large project comes in, a large PD comes in, they'll do their normal CEQA review, but for the greenhouse gas emissions section, it'll be referencing this document that's approved.
It can. It doesn't have to, but it can choose to reference that document, provided that it's in compliance with all of the measures within the plan.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other questions of staff, because I see a lot of people in the audience, but I don't have cards. I want to give an opportunity if somebody wants to speak. So, Commissioner Sayoc.
Just to follow that question, with the, I don't know if this is specific to our consultant, but when the formulas were created and inputted into our modeling, when we analyzed future impacts, specifically with the North 40, do you happen to know what numbers they were working from? And let me give you the reason why I'm asking. Since that's going to be such a significant project for us, I'm afraid that if they're able to tier off from this, I just want to make sure that the data they actually use to estimate their GHGs were similar to what we are currently looking at now.
It used the numbers that were analyzed in the general plan EIR.
Okay, so it did take the highest ceiling that we had looked at in the general plan, and so our assumption then is that the numbers have gone down, and so the GHGs would go down as well.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other technical questions for staff right now? I just want to address those of you that are in the audience. Would be the time that I'd give you the opportunity to speak. You're certainly welcome to if you'd like to. If not, we're just going to proceed to substantive comments about the plan. So I see no movement. Commissioners, any substantive comments that you have regarding the plan? And if we want to go to, I don't want to be autocratic about how we do this, but I thought it might make sense to just look at Appendix E and try to take the sections. We have a transportation and land use section with different implementation measures that are proposed in there. And it goes on to open space, solid waste management, energy, green building. So I would propose taking categories, if that makes sense. Commissioner Bourgeois.
I think that's a good approach, but before we go there, I actually have a couple questions about the council and community input and some of those changes. So those would not necessarily be reflected in that process. If I could go, okay. So I really appreciated the list of the changes that have been made. That was very helpful. But I had questions about several of them. I think one of the main ones, and I'm going to get to this when we start talking about water and wastewater, when we get to that section as well, is the measure that was deleted promoting the use of reclaimed water. I'm just wondering what the rationale or thinking was behind deleting that.
And Mr. Capurso is walking forward, so. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. That item was discussed at council, and it basically came down to what the long-range plan is for the reclaimed water system. And we know from our work with both Santa Clara Valley Water and San Jose Water and the whole reclaimed effort that the real time that the real timeline for construction for potentially bringing that wastewater line out to the West Valley areas is at least 20 years off, if not longer. And so council, after much discussion, felt that it probably doesn't belong in this plan at this point, because this is something that we would likely revisit within that time frame. So there was no real hope of implementation within that time frame.
Great, thanks. That clarifies it. I have a couple other questions about some of the deletions. Let's see. Deleted intensification along Santa Cruz Avenue and Main Street to focus on Los Gatos Boulevard only. I'm just curious, did they feel that the intensification was already at capacity along Santa Cruz and Main, or why the focus only on Los Gatos Boulevard?
It was for what you said. They felt that there was already a level of intensity that could not be increased at this point.
All right, that's good for now.
Anyone else? Commissioner Sayak.
If we could just go back to the discussions you've had with council, and my concerns, well, they're process related, but they're also concerns with just water conservation efforts. And so the biggest one that jumped out at me is when they did the prioritization, it did get moved to the 2015 to 2020 phase. And so if you could just talk with me about what the discussion was like and why this, in my opinion, is such an important component of our sustainability plan and why it was pushed back.
So that discussion involved partly around what Los Gatos really is represented as, and we don't necessarily want to waste water, but at the same time we're seen the town of Los Gatos is seen as a very green community. We have a very lush vegetation, and the council thought that an earlier time frame was perhaps not the most appropriate, that it would be more appropriate to revisit it in a later time frame to allow a thorough analysis to decide whether you want to go to the direction of saving a substantial amount of water and whether or not that would impact the image of Los Gatos.
Other questions?
And then one more, again, related to process. One of the things that is in the plan talks about implementation and measurements afterwards. And so we have to do reporting. And so who quantifies whether or not we are meeting our reduction? And how is that reported and who it's reported to? Could you just walk me through, once this is approved, what happens next?
So the way that information would be quantified and measured and followed up with throughout the years is based on the same functions that we use to create the plan. That information the calculations were provided by the consultants. They would provide us the formulas so that if we so choose, a member of staff could either be taught to use the formulas or a member of staff that perhaps takes over the position of sort of a sustainability coordinator or environmental services coordinator could use those formulas for themselves. The other reason that we would also have those formulas is should we choose to have another consultant do the calculations in the future, they would have access to the same calculations as opposed to using completely different calculations and not really being able to compare apples to apples. In terms of how we would do that, whether or not it would be a staff member or consultant hasn't been decided yet. That would be decided in the future, probably based largely on funding. I think I missed one of your questions. Okay. Oh,
I think it was does it get reported and who does it get reported to?
thank you. So the person that we would report it to is ourselves. So whether we decide to do that on a yearly update and update the town to see where we are in meeting our goals, or whether we do it every 2 years hasn't yet been decided. There are other agencies that are interested in it, such as the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, so it's likely that they would check in with us over the course of the next few years to see where we are.
Actually, I have a follow-up on that. Don't we have state law requirements for reductions, and aren't we at some point going to have to report these to state or local agencies?
The first part is correct. I'm not aware of the second part, whether or not the state agency requires us to send the information to them, but our consultant may be able to answer that when she arrives.
Commissioner Bourgeois.
I have a follow-up on that same question as well. I had flagged this in the document. When we're talking about monitoring and reviewing first of all, we say we're going to review and modify the sustainability plan as a whole every 3 years. How is that linked into the monitoring and reporting? And then it also says as part of the monitoring evaluation, we are going to re-inventory our emissions, but it doesn't give a timetable for that. So I'm just wondering how those are going to link up.
So it's likely that the remonitoring would occur every year, and the monitoring and the reevaluation of the emissions are one and the same. It's monitoring to see where our emission levels are.
But is it also monitoring which programs or whatever have been implemented, and because we have targets of reduction for some of these actions, and I'm sure, are we quantifying that? I mean, we a lot of this is projection, right? It's put in a model and it's projected out, but is there some actualization of seeing that change, or is that just through recalculation of the emissions?
So the monitoring and the recalculations of emissions, that's all done with monitoring who's done what in terms of individual projects and whether or not they've reduced their emissions, in addition to any programs or policies that we're implementing. So it's done by piece, measure by measure, to see what our reductions are based on the value of each measure or the value of each project using that measure.
Call on myself. So you kind of answered my question a little bit that I had while you were speaking, but let's imagine that you're putting things into the 2012 to 2015 or the 2015 to 2020 category, and we implement a program or a measure, and it either works great or it doesn't work at all. So what kind of flexibility do we have in the document to say, you know what, that one does not work, it's not doing anything, or this one is really good, or we really need to move to this one? You know, how much flexibility is built into the document, and does the monitoring affect how you proceed as you go forward?
I don't have the exact numbers, but if you read through the report, above and beyond the state and federal regulations that the town will have to comply with that affect greenhouse gas emissions, the town has to do additional reductions of about 4,000 something carbon dioxide equivalent. And at this point, the plan approximates that we would do just over 9,000 carbon dioxide equivalents. So it definitely provides some flexibility. Should there be a program that is discovered that does not fit with the town or cannot be implemented, there is some flexibility built in within the plan that would still allow us to meet that target.
Other questions? Commissioner Bourgeois.
Sorry, I have another this is my big picture process question. This is kind of like the thing that was, gnawing at me as I was reading this whole thing is, you just mentioned we're not sure if it's going to be a consultant or staff time or whatever to handle this. Given the fact that we're already short-staffed, we already know what the budget's like. I mean, and there's a lot of work here to be done. How's it going to get done? And are we developing a work plan to, 2012 to 2015 is a big time period. I mean, how are we prioritizing within that zone? I have some comments about whether something should be 2012 or 2015, but even within that, what's the next step to develop a work plan? How much of this is feasible or reasonable?
Part of the analysis that we had the consultant do was to analyze what funding is out there. As the intent and the value to do sustainability measures specifically towards greenhouse gas emission reductions, more and more funding is becoming available through grants and other funding sources. So there's the potential to implement a lot of these measures through funding sources. For those that can't be implemented through funding sources, there's the possibility that through other funding sources that the town may come into resources. And I'm sorry, that actually doesn't sound very eloquent, but there may be other opportunities, not just through grants, but perhaps through partnerships with other agencies that have funding available, that we'd be able to implement some of those measures. In terms of implementing the plan itself, the plan does call to have for some staff member to oversee the implementation. The staff member for that position or additional responsibility has not yet been chosen. So there's still some details and flexibility in that sense.
And so when that person's chosen, then there'll be a work plan developed for that 2012 to 2015 time period, and then prioritization will occur within that group of projects. And then will that just be approved at the staff level, or does that come back to any sort of deciding body, or is that just staff decision at that point?
It's highly unlikely that it would be all staff decision, especially considering that some of the measures include policies and programs that would have to come back to Planning Commission and Town Council, if not other committees as well. So there's portions that would involve staff, those portions looking at specific projects and seeing whether or not they comply with the sustainability plan measures that are applicable to them. And then there's those higher policy and program measures that would involve deciding bodies and committees.
Commissioner Sack, you had your hand up.
I guess this, just a context to this, this is a very important issue to me. And so a lot of these questions, it's because I just want to ensure that this document that's very lengthy and has great information just doesn't become an obsolete document that sits by the wayside once it's approved. And so I think similar to Commissioner Bourgeois, I'm trying to think how to best make it an effective document and how to tie it into the existing documents that we're already working from. And so a lot of things were just discussed about the measures and how it's being implementation, how it's being calculated. And so, you know, I know it's not in there, and I know there's a recommendation for a sustainability coordinator, but you know, and somehow when the comments come back to council, it seems like there needs to be a process to work this through so that, similar to our CIP, when it comes on an annual basis, there is a deciding body that looks to make sure that the projects listed for those years follows and is consistent with the general plan. I'd like to see something along those lines so that every year as we start analyzing the work plan and looking at which measures are going to be implemented, which ones have been prioritized, that there is at least one body that's interested in this that can look and see that it does fulfill the sustainability plan that as we have here. So that's one recommendation. And I know that there's a lot of information here, a lot of measures, and we're lacking in resources. And so one of the things that I would hope that we can do tonight through the chair is just start prioritizing within the 2012 to 2015 measures. And again, I do have some issues on the ones that are placed in the 2015 to 20. Do we have any weight in recommending to the council which ones get put higher on the list when a work plan is developed? And so if we are able to do that today, I think that's great. But, you know, I need to know if you can help me craft what is most useful to staff when this goes to the town council. Do they just want to buy up saying the general, this is great? Or would it be more useful when you start developing a work plan, which ones are actually, in our opinion, going to be most effective?
So your discussion and your recommendations are very useful, and I think that we would benefit from them. I would agree with that. And we appreciate you taking the time to review the document and make those thorough comments. In regards to the process for updating and implementation, the update process, and as well as the prioritization of the measures, both of those components, you can make recommendations regarding both of those components, and the town council will receive verbatim minutes, so they will have those recommendations to take into consideration.
Commissioner Smith, you had your hand up.
Yes, but it had to do with process, and it's been covered. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, do we want to then move to, are people comfortable with moving to comments? So if you look at your appendix E, it does actually list different action items under the various categories, and it also sets out the timeframe in which that is theoretically supposed to be implemented. So what I would do is ask people for any comments or changes to priorities or anything that they might have with respect to the implementation measures for transportation and land use. And that's basically found on the first page and the second half page of Appendix E. So are there any comments or questions regarding any of those implementation measures? I don't see any. So I'm going to take that to mean that commissioners are comfortable with what's been listed in the transportation and land use section and the time frame for implementation. Is that correct? And I'm seeing nodding. So the next section I'm going to say is green building, and that starts on the middle of page 2 and goes to actually just the last half of page 2. And again, there are implementation measures and timeframes for those. Any comments or not really questions, any comments regarding those? Okay, Commissioner Sayoc.
So in terms of priorities, I would think that this is what I would highlight as priority number 1. Because if you look at what was most helpful for me was table 5.1 in our sustainability plan, where you can actually see it itemizes the total reductions per category. And you'll see that transportation and land use, the section that we had just covered, it quantifies that it would have the most substantial reductions. My only caveat and hesitation and pause with that is that a lot of the measures that are listed there require community-wide participation. And while it's great, and it definitely involves substantial change in our habits, it's an area where I feel that we could put a lot of effort into it, but if it's not implemented town-wide, we may not get the reductions that we're hoping for. And so when I then look at the next category, which is the green building, and they estimate that you can get 2,380, a total reduction there with those measures, and particularly since that's an area where we, as a commission, actually can make some substantial recommendations, I would highlight that as one of my most important priorities. Actually, I would say that would be priority number 1 for me.
Commissioner Bourgeois.
Ditto. I had priority number 1 written in the margin next to this, so I would echo those sentiments.
And just procedurally, I'm going to suggest as the chair, if anyone, if all commissioners agree with that, can we just make a consensus motion for our record that the commission would like that to be the first priority, the green building implementation measures? Anyone have an objection to that? Can we just do a consensus? Yes, Commissioner O'Donnell.
I just want to ask a question. As I understand the discussion, although transportation and land use might, in fact, affect greater reductions, the feeling is that difficult to implement. That's what I hear being said. On the other hand, green building, since it's basically an ordinance, is something we can impose on the community. So I understand that, whereas if the community has to be involved and do something voluntarily, we don't think it's going to happen. But if we get to impose something on the community, we think that'll happen. So as I understand where we're going here, we're saying imposition is good, voluntariness is not good. That's what I hear being said.
If I may, the way I would paraphrase it is, if you're looking at specific concrete numbers, there's, as someone that was working in public policy, there's more reassurance in knowing that you make things happen through regulation versus hoping things will happen through voluntary change. And so that's how I see it, but yes. And
let me just say that while that may be effective and correct, I have a problem with solving problems by imposition. It's just something that disturbs me a bit. I'm not, this is a very thought-provoking document, I think, and I'm kind of thinking out loud. So I'm not quarreling with that, but I am saying it disturbs me somewhat when we say to the community, we get a lot more bang for the buck if you guys would all cooperate, but we don't think you will. Therefore, when you come in, we'll have some good regulations for you, and you will comply. So, stated that way, philosophically, it's disappointing, but it may be accurate. So I just throw that out for the purposes of showing my malaise with that.
Point taken. And so then the question is, can we agree that understanding what people's philosophical differences may be, can we agree as the Planning Commission that we can recommend that the green building measures be our first priority in our recommendation to the council? If we can't, that's fine, but I just wonder if we can. Commissioner Erickson.
Before we move that direction, so I would wholeheartedly support that. I would, however, also want us to consider whether goal measure, I guess they're measures, GB5, the time frame for that could be changed, because if this is our highest priority, I would worry about whether we would wait to identify and remove the barriers to the 215 to 20 time frame. What concerns me about that is it could be 220 in that time frame before we would remove those, and it seems to me that some of the other measures imply to a certain extent that we are doing some of that. And so I would want the commissioners to think about changing the time frame if we're going to make this a high priority.
So given what's just occurred, which is good discussion, it's probably not good to try for consensus motions. It's probably better for everyone to make a comment. So any other comments on the green building proposed implementation measures? Okay, seeing none. So everybody's comments are obviously going to be incorporated for the record, and so the town council can take a look at them. So if there's nothing else, I'm going to move on to renewable energy and low carbon fuels. And that is most of page 3. And again, you see the timeframes that are proposed and the priorities that are associated. Any comments on those implementation measures, renewable energy and low carbon fuels? Commissioner Bourgeois.
I'm a little hesitant to bring this up, but I was just maybe curious to understand the discussion that happened around leaf blowers. I mean, it's something that keeps popping up again and again and again. And it sounds like it's something, obviously, the community and/or council wanted to consider, but it's been punted down the road. And I'm just curious as to why that's not in the 2012 to 2015 timeframe.
The discussion regarding an ordinance and leaf blowers, it was in the first iteration that council saw. Council removed it. Through the community workshop, a community member suggested putting it back in. Therefore, it went back in for the second iteration that council saw, and council chose to leave it in there in consideration that it's something we can consider in the future. And the goal-oriented document does create some flexibility should it not be decided as being appropriate for the town of Los Gatos at this time.
Other comments on the renewable energy and low carbon fuel measures? Commissioner Sayak.
This is just a very minor detail, but I don't know much about leaf blowers. Is there, but it's always specific to two-stroke engine leaf blowers. Are there many types, or is that pretty much it? Todd, great. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, there are several types. I'm not maybe as familiar with all the gasoline types, but there's at least 2 gasoline types that I'm familiar with, and there's also the electric type. And so it is true, to answer maybe both of the comments and concerns that have come up, that from a greenhouse gas perspective, there's certainly reasons to take a look at it. This may come up sooner rather than later because of the noise issue. So it's really to address this as the two-stroke gasoline engine issue. That really hits the issue in terms of the GHG with the oily black smoke that people are all typically when you complain about leaf blowers from the emissions perspective, that's what it is. But so many of the other concerns about leaf blowers are often tied to noise, and noise does not confine itself to the two-stroke gasoline. There's noise from the electric ones as well. So I think we will possibly revisit this issue sooner than 2015, but it may be for reasons other than what's in the sustainability plan.
Thank you, Mr. Capurso. Any other comments regarding the renewable energy implementation measures? Okay, seeing none. We'll go to energy conservation, which is the last item on page 3 and goes all the way through to the first quarter of page 5. Any comments on those? Okay, seeing none. And I should note that our consultant is here, so if there's questions, thank you for coming. Sorry about the traffic. Then we'll go to water and wastewater. Those measures, we did have comments and questions about those earlier, but if there are any other comments on those measures, now's the time. Commissioner Sayak.
You know, I said it earlier, and so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but understanding, again, the discussion that occurred at the council level regarding the reasoning why it was pushed back to 2015, 2020, I would just like to comment how important I think this is for sustainability, and that to me, this is priority number 2. And so if this could be moved towards 2012, 2015, that is something that I would highly recommend.
Other comments on the wastewater? Commissioner Bourgeois.
Again, I concur. That was the big one that was circled was this category and why everything was pushed back. And if it's an aesthetic that council was concerned about, the lushness of the community and the aesthetic, I don't think that's a good reason to postpone this. I mean, I think we actually need to do education on what a water conserving aesthetic looks like and what the natural ecosystem of this area really supports when you talk about water conserving vegetation. And it's not a lush lawn. And I think we need to face that reality sooner rather than later. So this is my number 2 priority as well. And if I make a motion, I'm probably going to recommend that this whole category gets pushed up to 2012 to 2015. So,
any other comments on this? I'm actually going to echo that because I think that we have requirements in other policies that the town's already adopted regarding native landscaping and water conservation, and obviously the kinds of things that can go in, for example, our riparian corridors. So it just makes sense to me that we would promote something that is already contained in other kinds of policies for the town, which are moving towards native plants, if you will, that don't use so much water. So it makes sense to me that we would also do that here. So that's my comment. And now we're going to go to solid waste. And I've lost track of the pages, but 6. Any comments on the implementation measures under solid waste? Commissioner Sayak.
More just a question of staff. Have we been able to quantify if recycling has gone up now that we've put the recycling containers all over town?
Yes, recycling has gone up. I don't have the numbers. Unfortunately, we don't have the numbers this evening, but they have gone up substantially.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
It seems like it's something we could do, as opposed to some of these things are hopeful. this appears to be something we could do from the standpoint of sooner than later, and we've made it later, so I'm not quite sure why.
Staff want to comment on that?
That was part of council's discussion, and the mayor is on a board, I believe it's the California League of Cities, that is looking to do it. That may not be the right organization. There's a citywide organization that is looking at implementing that in this particular area of the county. So it's possible that that may come to fruition sooner than our implementation schedule and the implementation plan, just from a county-wide perspective.
Okay, other comments or questions on the solid waste implementation measures? Okay, open space. Commissioner Bourgeois.
Again, I'm a little hesitant to ask this, having served on the Parks Commission and been part of a failed attempt at a community garden in a neighborhood, but I was curious why, especially on OS1, where we talk about inventory of potential sites, this looks like town parks have been specifically removed from consideration. If you go to the staff report, it was one of the items, let's see, page 4 of the staff report. I think it's like the third bullet from the bottom, deleted reference to potential community garden sites in existing parks. So I was just curious as to why. I mean, I know parks are very sacred in this town, and I understand that, but I'm just wondering why they were completely removed.
Well, I think you answered your own question. It was certainly, I recall some discussion around some of the other efforts that we've discussed in what you might call changes to existing parks, and the efforts that we're undertaking now to memorialize all of our existing parks inventory with the master plans that you've no doubt seen come before you. And to date, as we've gone out to individual neighborhoods, we have not found that any neighborhood has expressed an interest in taking up existing parkland to use that as a community garden space. I don't really have a great answer other than it's just not come up, and it seems like we have probably other opportunities where there'd be probably less opposition, because I do suspect that if we were to go into an existing park and consider the removal of other park amenities, that we would have a whole neighborhood issue that we'd have to contend with.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Capurso. Any other comments or questions on the open space measures? Commissioner Sayak.
What, with regard to open space, there's a section in the background that talks about if future projects result in the removal of a significant amount of biomass that is not planned for in the general plan. What's considered significant? And the context behind this is for upcoming projects that are currently open space. When do we have to account for this if it's not planned for in the general plan?
I think the basically nothing that's in the town right now, like for example, the North 40 site and the vegetation that's on that site currently is of an amount that's large enough that it would make an impact in the town's measurable GHG emissions, or that it would show a measurable increase in emissions if that biomass, which is currently sequestering carbon, were to be removed. And so I think that right now, under your current general plan, there's really nowhere in town that there would be an individual project that would remove a substantial amount of biomass.
Thank you.
I think it's a related question, and I apologize to Commissioners Sayak and Bourgeois. I'm going to get this term wrong. There was a policy comment about creating heat somethings. Heat islands, yes, thank you. And so I was imagining, say, the North 40 that you're talking about now. You take an orchard, and now you build on it. So I would imagine that you create a heat island. So what would the specific plan we're developing for the North 40, how would that have to be manipulated to not create that kind of thing? How would we get open space so that we would fit with this sustainability plan? How are they going to, would they potentially interrelate would be my question. You may not have an answer to that, but it just strikes me that you take an orchard and you develop on it, you have a heat island.
Sure.
Or you lose biomass. So how does that all relate to each other when we do these policies?
The I was just looking to see if I could find the measure that references heat island specifically. The concept of a heat island doesn't only have to do with the change from vegetated ground cover to hard surfaces like paving, but what it really has to do with is the color. And it's about especially black parking lots, black rooftops absorb more heat and then reflect that heat back, and that's what creates the heat island. And so the concepts behind heat island mitigation are to use lighter colored paving and roofing materials so that the sunlight that happens during the day isn't absorbed and then reflected back outside of daylight hours. So that would be the strategy for reducing heat island effect from development that takes the place of vegetated ground cover.
Other comments or questions on the open space measures? And our last one is community action. Comments on the community action measures. Okay, I don't see anyone. So that brings us to the end of the implementation measures. Now I'll ask for any kind of more generalized comments or questions. Commissioner Bourgeois?
Thanks. I would hate for Ms. Jensen to sit in traffic and not get to ask her a technical question. So I had a little trouble following the target and gap analysis. Could you maybe explain the purpose of that and what the gap is and how we meet that? I think it's section 4, like page 4.2.
Sure, I'm happy to. I guess I would say as a disclaimer that part of the reason this section is in here and that it's worded the way that it is in anticipation of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District review. And this is the kind of quantification of the target and gap analysis is something that we expect that they do want to see in this plan. And I understand that it's not really something intuitive in the way that language about green building or community gardens is. So I understand your difficulty. So basically the concept here is that we want to find out how much Los Gatos needs to do to add to the reductions that will already occur because of state and federal measures if the town were to do nothing at all. There's different approaches to measuring this, and you can find climate action plans, which are similar to your sustainability plan, out there that account for local measures first, and they kind of show a larger attribution to local measures and then state and federal measures second. We believe in our methodology in our firm that it's more accurate to account for state and federal measures first and then show what additional gains could be made by local measures. And so the target, I'm not sure if you need additional explanation about both the target and the gap, or really mostly about the gap. So the gap then is the difference between what we estimate would be emitted in 2020 based only on state and federal changes to things like fuel standards or adding a smart grid in California, the way that energy is generated and transmitted statewide, things that the town has no control over. All those types of measures that are happening at the federal and the state level will contribute to measurable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that are happening here within the borders of Los Gatos. And when we account for all of those, we concluded that in 2020, your emissions would be 328,620 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. That is very close to the target, which is 15% below baseline of 324,390 metric tons. And so the gap there is only that difference of 4,230 metric tons. So from I shouldn't even say that. I would not want to create the impression that you only need to do 4,220 metric tons, because again, the Air District and other reviewers will really look to the town to see, well, you know, we need some buffer in there. Maybe not all these measures will be as effective as we're hoping. Maybe they won't be as widely adopted. Maybe they won't work out the way that we are assuming they will in our modeling here. So you shouldn't just plan to barely scrape by with a minimum number of emissions reductions to close that gap.
Thank you. You took it where my brain had took it to of you know, wow, are we really shooting this low?
Right.
But you missed an earlier discussion about monitoring, and so as these state and regional measures when we have our reevaluation, does the assessment of those feed back into a revised target and gap analysis if some of them are more effective or less effective than we think?
At this time, it's really the monitoring of climate action plans and I could say GHG emissions reduction strategies, which is kind of a more generic title for your sustainability plan and for other climate action plans, is really evolving, as you're probably aware. You know, for example, right now, the only future year that we have any target for at the state level is 2020. That year is rapidly approaching. There's no guidance right now to say what an appropriate target would be for the year 2030 or 2050, or what future year you should look at as you get closer to the year 2020. So at this time, there's not a monitoring mechanism in place. Certainly, it makes a logical sense that as you move forward, you would need to look again at how you're doing with your target, and you would probably want to look again too at what's going on at the federal and state level to see how they're making up for additional emissions reductions. But I think that the framework for monitoring and reporting your emissions is going to continue to evolve.
And so one final follow-up, if I may. So the prioritization that occurred in the implementation schedule, was it done with this gap in mind, or was this just an analysis for CARB, and the prioritization was done for what is going to be most effective and what can we implement the fastest? Or were we actually using this gap as a target?
No, the gap is not a target. I would say it's maybe more of a benchmark. We want to make sure that at a minimum we close the gap. In the case of Los Gatos, that was not hard to do. The way that the measures and the reductions are modeled, it's more of a total. And so the implementation schedule is really more based on what seemed feasible for the town, the feedback that we got from town council and concerns about burdens on town staff and what's realistic for town staff to achieve in the next 3 years versus farther out, rather than a relationship to trying to hit a certain target.
Commissioner Sack.
One of the other timeframes I know that that many cities are looking at is actually this year, the mayor's climate protection agreement that we had to reduce, I think, the 1990 levels. And do you know if any cities have reported out by 2012 as they said they were going to?
That is a great question. I don't know. I'd be happy to look into it and get back to you. I can get something to Jennifer.
Well, the next question is, because we signed on to it, are we supposed to report out, and
right.
Have we?
It's not a program that I am as familiar with as I am with other requirements associated with GHG emissions reduction program, and I believe it has a slightly different angle. I think, I don't know what your responsibilities are under that program, and I can't answer whether or not the town has any reporting.
Ms. Savage or Mr. Paulson, can you answer that question?
I don't have that information this evening.
I think the follow-up is in your recommendation. You could, between now and when it goes to town council, we can do what we can to get that information so the council has that before they make their determination.
Other questions? Commissioner O'Donnell.
Just to follow up on that, we're doing this, at least in part, I take it, because we are being told to do this. But we're not being told what happens if we don't do this. In other words, we want to do it anyway. It's a good thing to do, but forget that for a moment. Normally, when the state says do something, they have something that happens to you bad if you don't do it, at least theoretically. We don't know of any problem if we don't do it this year, we don't do it next year, if we don't do it.
It's true, and I think well, it was addressed in my presentation at our last meeting that there's not necessarily an explicit law the way there is a housing element law saying thou shalt adopt a green sustainability plan, GHG emissions reduction plan, whatever you want to call it. Right now, the primary mechanism through which the state or the regulatory agencies like the Bay Area Air Quality Management District are urging or compelling jurisdictions to adopt these type of plans is through CEQA. The CEQA guidelines have been updated as of 2010 to require an analysis of GHG emissions reductions, and the Bay Area Air Quality Management District has adopted guidelines which are currently suspended due to a court challenge to allow perks for jurisdictions that have an adopted GHG emissions reduction strategy, that's the term in the statute, to allow CEQA streamlining for projects that are consistent with that strategy. So that's the carrot that has been offered.
Let me just, I'm a little lost. Normally, I would think CEQA applies to a project.
Sure.
If the city or the town just sits there, there's no project, is there?
Right, that's the case. Where the town would run into trouble is if you, certainly if you want to do an EIR, like if you've already done your general plan and your general plan EIR, if you were in that position today and you attempted to do an EIR, you would be required to look at GHG emissions, which we were actually at the time that we did your general plan and EIR, and to demonstrate that you were doing the most that you could to mitigate GHG emissions reductions. And by the time you write all those mitigation measures, you've essentially written a plan like this. So if given the fact that you don't have that staring down, you probably have a little bit more freedom to maneuver. But I think when you get to the point of looking at EIRs on more significant projects like the North 40 specific plan.
Yeah, that's why, then the next question would be, for example, somebody comes in, a developer, and they do have to do, let's assume, an environmental impact report or whatever. Clearly CEQA applies to them. Right. They have no power to adopt for the town a sustainability plan. So I assume when they do their EIR or negative declaration, mitigate, whatever, they don't have to deal with it.
They would then have, if the town didn't have a plan and or if the project was not consistent with that plan, then that project EIR would need to include an independent GHG emissions analysis for the impacts of that project and attempt to mitigate the GHG emissions of that project.
Just that project?
Of that project.
Thank you.
Other questions? Commissioner Bourgeois.
I don't know if this is for staff or for my fellow commissioners, and just hearing this discussion, it sounds like at least the way this commissioner is leaning, we're talking about bumping up the time frame of the implementation schedule for a handful of elements. Given respect to staff's capability of doing this in the next 2.5 years before 2015, we haven't recommended anything to be moved back to kind of compensate that workload, and that is just causing me some concern. So I don't know if there are items that staff or the consultants have some thoughts on that could be pushed back to the later time frame as kind of a trade-off, or if other commissioners have that same concern as I do or have ideas on that, how to handle that.
I can just say from the consultant's perspective that I don't foresee any concerns about the modeling results or the achieving your target from changing the timeframes on these measures. So I do think there is some flexibility for the town to assign implementation schedules that work best and seem the most achievable for the town and the staff.
Commissioner Erickson.
this is a question for staff as a follow-up to Commissioner Bourgeois. I assume as part of the plan that one isn't at the point where one has determined whether there's staff capacity to do the plan as it's been presented. I assume one isn't at that place. So I guess, assuming, in a moment you can correct me if that's wrong, but assuming that were the case, I would be reluctant to push anything back because I wouldn't have any basis upon which to assume that the capacity of the staff couldn't do either what was in the plan or what we were proposing to put up. So I'd have to know what the staff capacity, some estimate of what the staff capacity is before I would be willing to push some things back.
Commissioner O'Donnell, you had your hand up. Was your question answered? Or
Well, what Commissioner Erickson said, I would just join that by, I guess, saying that ultimately the staff is going to have to tell the town, or bring to their attention at least, what they're capable of doing. And they're much more expert on that than we are. We're trying to be empathetic by saying, gee whiz, if we're asking you to do something ahead of schedule, maybe we ought to give you a balance. But I personally feel totally inadequate to that, but I know the staff would be adequate. So if we get to the point where we make recommendations as to order, which are different than presently, and that causes the staff some problem, I would assume the staff would respond at this level, I guess, to the town council by saying, fine, we can do the order, but we can't do everything at once, within the timeframes, if that's the case. So I guess I'm saying I don't know that we have to worry about that.
any other questions or comments? Commissioner Smith.
I just want to make one comment, which speaks to all of it, I believe. I noticed that under communication action, there's training an existing town staff member to be the sustainability coordinator for the town. And it seems to me that given the comments that were just made about the burden on the town, that I don't know about appointing that coordinator in 2015 when implementation of certain items are supposed to take place in 2012 to 2015. I just wonder, I mean, that's like something, it seems to me we should have this person appointed, trained, ready to go, because this plan is going to be implemented. So you want to comment to that, Jennifer? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so we can definitely take that into consideration to change the time frame on that particular position. But it should be noted that the quote-unquote position of the sustainability coordinator will not necessarily be encompassed in one staff position. It's possible that the responsibilities for implementation of the plan, the sustainability coordinator responsibilities, may be shared between staff so that staff can implement measures of the plan.
Commissioner Erickson.
Consistent with, I think, what's the spirit of that, how much to ask this question, how much all of this will be accomplished by changing the way we do business as a town, if you would, rather than adding additional staff time? There are opportunities to change the way one does business with a consciousness, as opposed to saying, okay, and I guess what I'm wondering out loud about is the sustainability plan an isolated sustainability plan that's off to the side over here, or is our intent as a town to embed a consciousness about the kind of principles that are behind this? I understand there are very specific measures into all the things that we do that would help us accomplish them, so it might change I don't know how that would specifically manifest itself, but that staff in various departments would change the way they approach doing certain things that would then help us accomplish the bigger goal, so that it might not necessarily always take additional staff time.
Let me just add a footnote to that too. Consistent with what you just said, of course, there is a cost analysis, which is to say, were one to implement these things, whatever order, is there an added cost to the town, which I have to guess there might be, and if so, ballpark, what is it, and is the town able to do it? Now, I'm not asking for that answer today. Well, I guess what I'm saying is, before one adopts all this, should the town council know what the cost implications are, and if there are any, where the money is coming from?
I don't know if staff or the consultant can answer either of those, if you'd like to give a try, Ms. Jansen.
Sure. I obviously am not town staff, so I don't want to speak for town staff, but I think to Commissioner Erickson's point, certainly my hope would be that this, and my expectation based on having worked in the town for several years now, is that this is a continuation of a philosophy that has been gaining, I think, strength and currency in Los Gatos from the community and from town staff members and from elected and appointed officials. There are measures affecting many, many different aspects of development. I think they can be incorporated into the very robust development review process that you already have. And so in that way, I think many of them will not take extra time and will become kind of second nature as they are integrated into your existing procedures. In addition, there are obviously a set of measures that are specific to municipal operations, and I think that really demonstrates and will inculcate a sense of personal responsibility among town staff members for contributing to this community-wide goal of reducing GHGs and becoming more sustainable. So that would certainly be my expectation. In terms of the cost, obviously we do include what I would characterize in many cases as a qualitative cost-to-benefit analysis in the sustainability plan. I know that for many people it's desirable to have a dollar amount. I know you acknowledge that may not be realistic, and to be honest with you, it's not as easy as we might like to assign a dollar amount to these things. We're not sure right now exactly how much a certain type of photovoltaic panel might cost, or exactly how large of installation might be needed, for example. So it's very difficult for us to really accurately forecast costs for this set of measures. I will say that overall, I think, as with many measures of this type, the hope would be that the cost savings in terms of energy conservation, water conservation, and similar efficiencies would, in the long run, outweigh any upfront costs of, for example, installing certain measures or adopting new procedures at the town level.
Okay, I was going to move us towards a motion, hopefully, but if it's
Well, let me
important.
just follow up, because this, in part, will be imposed upon people who want to build something in town, who file an application, and they obviously will pay more money to do whatever it is they're going to do. And to that extent, we don't know what the full implementation of this plan would mean for a person coming in saying, I want to build a home, or 6 homes, or a building. So we have no idea what that would cost, I take it. Secondly, we don't know to what extent the communities around us, I mean, there's no way to compare it. So I guess I'm just saying, whatever we do, we don't know what the applicants are going to pay for whatever we do, nor do we know how that will be for communities around us, insofar as people make choices as to where they live and where they build. So I think it's fair to say then that we seem dedicated, and maybe that's the way we should be, to doing good without knowing what the full ramifications of the costs of doing good is. So, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for really good questions, really good comments, and I know, hopefully, that they'll be taken into consideration. I'm hoping that I can actually ask one of our environmental experts to make a motion on this matter. Commissioner Bourgeois.
I'll take a stab at it. First of all, I'd like to commend staff and the consultants. I thought the sustainability plan and the EIR amendment addendum, were very good. I don't really have any qualms with the content. So I'm going to forward a recommendation to Town Council for adoption of the sustainability plan and the EIR addendum with the following recommended changes. And so the only changes that I'm going to recommend in my motion are changes to the implementation schedule for the following measures. First would be GB5. That is the one that Commissioner Erickson noted that was out of sync with the rest of the green building section. Measure RE4, which is the leaf blowers. All of the measures in the water and wastewater section, that's WW1 through WW6. SW8, which is the plastic bag ban, and CA2, which is the training of a sustainability coordinator. I would recommend that all of those get moved up to the 2012 to 2015 timeframe. I would also like the motion to note that among everything in the 2012 to 2015 timeframe, that it is the recommendation of the Planning Commission that the green building section receive top priority and the water and wastewater section receive the second priority as far as staffing and work planning. And that is my motion.
Thank you, Commissioner Bourgeois. Is there a second? Commissioner Sayak.
I'll second the motion.
Any comments or questions regarding the motion? Okay, I'm going to call the question. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? None. Passes unanimously with the motion made by Commissioner Bourgeois with the specific additions, seconded by Commissioner Sayak, and this will get forwarded to the Town Council. Thank you, everyone, for reviewing this very lengthy, complicated document and having great questions and great input. I really appreciate it. Before I adjourn the meeting, is there a report from Planning Director?
Yes, briefly, we'd just like to note that there are some vacancies for some committees and commissions, either currently vacant and or upcoming vacancies with some members' terms being up. It's our understanding that many of those intend to apply, but specifically relating to bodies that the Planning Commission partakes in. The General Plan Committee has one vacancy for a resident. The Historic Preservation Committee has a vacancy coming up for a term that's expiring in December, and then the Planning Commission has a term that's expiring in December. The deadline for submitting applications to the town clerk is October 8th, and the interviews are scheduled before the Town Council for October 22nd. You can look on the town's website at www.loscatoca.gov/commission application for applications for that. So anyone's invited to apply for those. And I see some silent questions at the end. Charles Erickson is the Planning Commissioner, and Catherine Janoff is the Historic Preservation Committee member whose terms are expiring.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. I have one commission matter. Does anyone else have one? The commission matter for staff is that Commissioner Smith has requested that she be reassigned from the Historic Preservation Committee because she's got timing conflicts with the time of meeting, and Commissioner O'Donnell has graciously agreed to switch with Commissioner Smith. So Commissioner Smith will go to the CDAC, and Commissioner O'Donnell will go to Historic Preservation. And thank you very much. And I guess we'll get a memo or something indicating, formalizing that. But thank you very much. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.